Something is breaking right now. Maybe it is your finances. Maybe it is your relationship, your career, your health, your sense of direction, or your belief that the future is going to be okay. Maybe it is all of it at once, pressing down on you from every direction. And what makes it genuinely unbearable, what takes it from difficult to devastating, is not just the situation itself. It is the feeling of losing your grip. The feeling that the one thing you thought you could count on, your own mind, is starting to betray you. The racing thoughts at 3 in the morning. The tightness in your chest that never fully goes away. The spiral that starts the moment something goes wrong and doesn't stop until you've convinced yourself that everything is ruined and nothing will ever be okay again. That experience is not weakness, it is biology. And biology can be trained. This audiobook is not going to tell you to breathe and think positive. It is not going to hand you a list of affirmations and send you on your way. What it is going to do is go deep, far deeper than most people are willing to go into the science, the psychology, and the unvarnished truth of what it actually means to build a mind that stays calm when life refuses to cooperate. You are going to understand why your mind behaves the way it does under pressure. You are going to understand the mechanics of panic, the neuroscience of calm, the psychology of identity, and the philosophy of endurance. And then you are going to be given a complete, practical, layered system for training yourself, not just to cope, but to genuinely transform the way you respond to difficulty. Here is what most people fundamentally misunderstand about calm. They believe it is a personality trait. They believe some people are simply wired to handle chaos, to stay composed under fire, to keep moving when everything around them is collapsing. And when they watch those people, they feel either admiration or resentment or both, because they assume that steadiness is something those people were born with, something they themselves simply do not have. That belief is wrong. Calm is not a gift. It is a skill. It is built, not inherited. And like every skill in existence, it can be learned, practiced, refined, and ultimately mastered by anyone who is willing to do the work. By the time you finish this audiobook, you will have that skill. Not as a theory, as a lived reality. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The illusion of control: why your mind breaks when life does. There is something your brain is doing right now, every single second of every single day, that you are almost certainly not aware of. It is building a model of the world, a detailed, constantly updated internal map of how things work, what to expect, what is safe, what is dangerous, what is reliable, and what is not. Your brain does this automatically, unconsciously, and with extraordinary sophistication, drawing on everything you have ever experienced, every pattern you have ever noticed, every outcome you have ever learned to predict. And embedded in that model, woven through the very architecture of your psychology, is one of the most powerful and most dangerous assumptions a human being can make. The assumption that you are in control, not total control, perhaps. You are not naive enough to believe you control the weather or the economy or the behavior of other people. But in the quiet, private corners of your mind, you believe you need to believe that if you plan carefully enough, work hard enough, make smart enough decisions, and avoid the obvious mistakes, then life will more or less go the way you intend it to. That belief is not stupidity. It is a survival mechanism. The brain requires a sense of predictability to function efficiently. It needs to feel that its model of the world is accurate, that its predictions are reliable, and that the effort it puts into understanding cause and effect will pay off in the form of outcomes it can anticipate. Without that sense of predictability, the brain cannot prioritize, cannot plan, cannot rest. Without it, everything becomes a potential threat. And so the brain constructs the illusion of control with extraordinary care. It constructs it through routine, the comfort of doing the same things in the same order, which creates the sensation that the day is manageable. It constructs it through planning the relief that comes from writing things down, making lists, setting goals, as if the act of articulating an intention gives you power over whether it will be realized. It constructs it through expectation, the quiet, often unspoken belief that because you have put in the effort, because you have done what was required of you, the outcome you are hoping for is somehow owed to you. The promotion, the stability, the healthy relationship, the thriving family, the body that cooperates, the future that looks the way you imagined it. And then something happens. Something you did not plan for, did not see coming, did not deserve, and the model shatters. This is the moment most people describe as life falling apart. But what is actually happening, what is happening neurologically, psychologically, at the deepest level of how the mind processes reality, is not that life is falling apart, it is that the illusion is falling apart. The map your brain built so carefully, the model it has been relying on to navigate the world, has been contradicted by reality. And your nervous system's response to that contradiction is not philosophical curiosity. It is alarm, pure, visceral, full-body alarm. The panic you feel when the diagnosis comes, when the relationship ends, when the job disappears, when the money runs out, that panic is not a sign that you are weak or that the situation is necessarily as catastrophic as it feels. It is a sign that your brain's model of the world has just been invalidated, and your survival systems have kicked in to deal with what they perceive as a life-threatening level of uncertainty. This is why people who are otherwise intelligent, capable, and resilient can completely fall apart when things go wrong. It is not because the difficulty is too great. It is because the loss of perceived control triggers a neurological cascade that makes clear thinking nearly impossible. And here is the critical point. As long as you believe that the goal is to get control back, to fix the situation, solve the problem, restore the order, you will remain trapped in a cycle of panic and exhaustion, because you are fighting a war you cannot win against the fundamental unpredictability of life. The philosopher Epictetus, who spent years of his life as a slave, before becoming one of the most influential thinkers in history, identified what may be the single most important distinction a person can ever make. He called it the dichotomy of control. Some things are within our power, he said, and some things are not. Within our power are our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our choices, our responses. Not within our power are our bodies, our reputations, our positions, the actions of other people, the conditions of our lives, Epictetus argued, and modern psychology has since confirmed that virtually all human suffering is rooted in our refusal to honor this distinction. We spend our energy desperately trying to control what we cannot control, and neglecting the only domain where our power is absolute, how we respond to what happens. This is not a passive idea. It is not resignation. It is not telling you to give up or accept defeat or stop trying to improve your circumstances. What it is telling you is this: the goal is not control. The goal is clarity. The goal is to get so clear about what you can actually influence your thoughts, your actions, your interpretations, your choices, that you stop wasting your psychological resources on everything outside that domain. Because the energy you are currently spending trying to control the uncontrollable is not neutral. It is actively destructive. It keeps your nervous system in a state of perpetual alarm. It keeps your thinking clouded. It keeps you reactive rather than responsive, desperate rather than deliberate. Researchers who study what is known as the locus of control have found that people who believe the outcome of their life is primarily determined by external forces, other people's decisions. Luck. Circumstances consistently experience higher levels of anxiety, depression, and helplessness, and lower levels of resilience, performance, and well-being. Meanwhile, people who believe that their responses and choices, even within difficult circumstances, are the primary driver of their experience, consistently show higher levels of mental health, greater resilience in the face of adversity, and dramatically better long-term outcomes. The difference is not in the circumstances. The difference is in where people believe their agency lives. The first step in training your mind to stay calm when life gets hard is not a breathing exercise or a mindset hack. It is a fundamental philosophical reorientation. It is the decision made consciously, deliberately, and repeatedly to stop measuring your stability by whether things are going according to plan, and to start measuring it by the quality of your response to whatever is actually happening. When you make that shift, everything changes. Not because the chaos disappears, but because you stop giving the chaos the power to determine your inner state. You stop being a person who is calm when life cooperates and shattered when it doesn't. You become, instead, a person whose calm does not depend on circumstances at all. That person is who this audiobook is building, and it starts with accepting fully, not reluctantly, that control was always an illusion, and that letting go of it is not loss. It is liberation. Chapter 2. The neuroscience of calm what your brain is actually doing when everything falls apart. If you have ever been in the middle of a genuine crisis and found yourself unable to think clearly, unable to make a rational decision, unable to remember basic information, unable to access the reasoning ability you know you normally have, you were not imagining it. Your thinking brain was not fully available to you. And understanding exactly why that happens, in biological terms, is not an academic exercise. It is foundational. Because you cannot build a calm mind without first understanding the machinery you are working with. Your brain is, among other things, a threat detection system of extraordinary sensitivity. Buried deep in the center of the brain, in a region called the limbic system, sits a small, almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. The amygdala's primary job is to scan your environment constantly, automatically, without any conscious input from you, for signals of danger. It processes sensory information faster than your conscious mind can, which means that by the time you are aware that something threatening is happening, your amygdala has already been working on it for several hundred milliseconds. It has already sent alarm signals throughout your brain and body. It has already begun triggering the release of stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline, that prepare you to fight, flee, or freeze. This response is ancient. It evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to protect human beings from immediate physical threats, predators, falling, starvation, enemy tribes, and it is extraordinarily effective for that purpose. When you are in physical danger, the amygdala's rapid automatic response is exactly what you want. It floods your body with adrenaline, which sharpens your senses, accelerates your heart rate, directs blood flow away from your digestive system and toward your large muscles, and essentially turns you into a faster, stronger, more reactive version of yourself. All of this happens in a fraction of a second, and it can genuinely save your life. The problem is that your amygdala cannot distinguish between a tiger and a difficult conversation, between a collapsing building and a threatening email, between physical danger and financial uncertainty. To the amygdala, a threat is a threat, and when it fires, when it decides that what you are experiencing right now constitutes a danger that requires an emergency response, it does something that is critical to understand. It suppresses the activity of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that makes you human in the most meaningful sense of the word. It is responsible for rational thought, long-term planning, impulse control, empathy, nuanced decision-making, the ability to consider consequences, the ability to see multiple perspectives simultaneously. It is, essentially, your wisest self, the part of you that thinks before acting, weighs options carefully, and makes decisions aligned with your deepest values rather than your most immediate fears. And when the amygdala goes into alarm mode, the prefrontal cortex goes offline. This is what researchers call the amygdala hijack, a term coined by psychologist Daniel Goleman. And it explains why intelligent, thoughtful people say and do things in moments of crisis that they would never say or do in a calm state. Their wisest self has been temporarily overridden by their most primitive self. Now, here is where it gets critical for our purposes. This hijack is not limited to sudden, acute crises. Chronic stress, the kind that comes from sustained periods of difficulty, uncertainty, financial pressure, relationship conflict, or any situation that keeps your threat detection system on long-term alert, gradually erodes the balance between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex in a way that makes you structurally more reactive over time. Studies using neuroimaging have shown that people who experience chronic stress actually have measurably larger amygdalae. Their threat detection system has literally grown in response to repeated alarm activation and measurably reduced gray matter density in the prefrontal cortex. The brain is physically changed by sustained stress. The regions responsible for panic grow stronger. The regions responsible for wisdom grow weaker. But here is the counterbalancing truth, and it is one of the most important scientific discoveries of the last 20 years. The brain is also physically changed by calm, by deliberate, practiced, sustained calm. The research on neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong ability to restructure itself based on repeated experience, has fundamentally transformed what scientists understand about the human mind's capacity for change. The brain you have right now is not the brain you are fixed with. Every time you practice a calming technique, every time you consciously choose a regulated response over a reactive one, every time you breathe deliberately in a moment of stress, you are laying down new neural pathways and strengthening existing ones. You are literally rewiring your brain at the cellular level. Landmark research by neuroscientist Sarah Lazar at Harvard Medical School found that people who practiced mindfulness meditation consistently showed increased cortical thickness in the prefrontal cortex and reduced amygdala volume reactivity, meaning their capacity for rational thought had physically grown, and their capacity for automatic panic had physically shrunk. This was not a metaphor. These were measurable structural changes in brain tissue, produced by nothing more than consistent mental practice. What this means for you is enormously hopeful. The reactive, spiraling, panic-prone version of your mind that you may have come to believe is simply who you are is not fixed. It is a current configuration of a highly adaptable organ. And the configuration can change, not by wishing it would, but by giving your brain the right kind of repeated experience. The experience of pausing before reacting, the experience of breathing through discomfort, the experience of choosing observation over catastrophizing. Done consistently and done with genuine engagement, these practices do not just change your behavior, they change your brain. And a changed brain changes everything about how life feels when it gets hard. Understanding the neuroscience is not enough on its own to create calm. But it does something essential. It strips away the shame. It removes the lie that you should simply be able to handle this, that the fact you are spiraling is a character flaw, that stronger people just don't fall apart the way you do. No, stronger people have trained their brains to regulate differently. And now, you will too. Chapter 3. Breathe before you think, the physiological reset that stops the spiral. Every technique in this audiobook matters. Every chapter builds on what came before it. But if there is one single practice that is more immediately powerful, more universally accessible, and more scientifically validated than any other when it comes to breaking the cycle of panic and restoring the capacity for clear thought, it is the breath. Not because breathing is simple, or because it is a beginner's tool that you will graduate beyond as you become more skilled, but because the breath is the only function in your body that is simultaneously automatic and under voluntary control. And that unusual dual nature makes it the most direct lever you have for reaching directly into your nervous system and manually shifting its state. To understand why breathing works the way it does, you need to understand the autonomic nervous system, the network that governs all the bodily functions you don't consciously control. Heart rate, digestion, immune function, hormone release, blood pressure. The autonomic nervous system has two primary branches. The first is the sympathetic branch, which is your accelerator. When the sympathetic system is dominant, your body is in a state of mobilization. Heart rate up, breathing fast and shallow, muscles tensed, senses sharpened, cortisol and adrenaline flowing. This is the stress response, the fight or flight state. The second is the parasympathetic branch, which is your brake. When the parasympathetic system is dominant, your body is in a state of rest and recovery. Heart rate slows, breathing deepens, muscles relax, digestion resumes, and the prefrontal cortex, your rational, wise brain, comes back online. In an ideal life, these two systems would take turns fluidly and appropriately, with the sympathetic system activating when genuine demands require it, and the parasympathetic system returning you to baseline once the demand has passed. But for most people living through sustained difficulty, the sympathetic system becomes the default. the body gets stuck in high gear. And the longer it stays there, the harder it becomes to shift out, because a chronically activated stress response literally changes the sensitivity of your threat detection systems, making you more reactive, not less. Over time, here is where the breath becomes your most powerful tool. Of all the bodily functions governed by the autonomic nervous system, the breath is the only one that you can take deliberate control of. Your heart rate will not directly obey your commands. Your digestion will not either, but your breathing will. And here is the crucial physiological fact. When you control your breathing deliberately and specifically, you directly influence the activity of the vagus nerve, the longest nerve in the body, running from the brainstem all the way down through the heart, lungs, and gut, which is the primary channel through which the parasympathetic nervous system communicates with your organs. Slow, deep, diaphragmatic breathing directly stimulates the vagus nerve, which directly activates the parasympathetic response, which directly lowers your heart rate, reduces cortisol, and brings your prefrontal cortex back online. You are not just calming your mind. You are chemically and neurologically shifting your body's operating state, using nothing but your own breath. One of the most effective breathing techniques to emerge from modern physiology research is what neuroscientist Andrew Huberman calls the physiological sigh. Research shows that throughout the day, especially during periods of stress, the small air sacs in the lungs called alveoli tend to partially collapse, reducing oxygen exchange and contributing to the physical sensation of anxiety and tension. The physiological sigh, a double inhale through the nose followed by a long, complete exhale through the mouth, immediately reinflates those alveoli and produces the fastest possible reduction in physiological arousal. You take a full breath in through your nose. Then, before exhaling, take a second sharp sniff in to top off the lungs completely. And then you exhale slowly and fully through your mouth until the lungs are empty. Done even once. This produces a measurable and immediate drop in heart rate and stress hormones. Done 2 or 3 times consecutively, it can shift your entire physiological state within 60 seconds. Another profoundly effective technique is box breathing, used by Navy SEALs, elite athletes, surgeons, and anyone else whose professional life demands the ability to stay calm under extreme pressure. Box breathing works by creating a rhythmic, equal count breathing pattern that engages the parasympathetic system while simultaneously giving the busy, anxious mind something concrete to focus on. You inhale slowly through the nose for a count of 4. Hold the breath, lungs full, for a count of 4. Exhale completely through the mouth for a count of 4. Hold the breath, lungs empty, for a count of 4. That is 1 cycle. Practiced for 4 to 6 cycles, this technique reliably produces a state of calm alertness, not drowsiness, not sedation, but the specific combination of relaxed body and activated mind that is optimal for both performance and clear decision-making. The 4-7-8 technique, developed by Dr. Andrew Weil and rooted in ancient pranayama practice, is particularly powerful as a reset for moments of acute anxiety or panic. You inhale quietly through the nose for a count of 4, hold the breath for a count of 7, and exhale completely through the mouth for a count of 8. The extended exhale is key physiologically. The exhale phase is associated with parasympathetic activation, so making the exhale longer than the inhale consistently and powerfully activates the calming branch of the nervous system. But breathing techniques are only part of what is available to you in the Physiological Reset Toolkit. Grounding techniques, practices that bring your awareness into your immediate physical environment and out of the catastrophizing spiral of your thoughts, are equally important and work through a different but complementary mechanism. The 5-4-3-2-1 technique is one of the most widely used and most effective. In a moment of anxiety or overwhelm, you bring your full attention to 5 things you can see right now. Then 4 things you can physically feel: the texture of the chair beneath you, the temperature of the air on your skin. Then 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. This technique works because anxiety is almost always future-focused. It lives in scenarios that haven't happened yet, in catastrophes that exist only in imagination. Grounding forces your attention into the present moment, into concrete sensory reality, and the prefrontal cortex, which processes present moment sensory information, begins to reactivate as a result. What is essential to understand about all of these techniques is that their power is not in knowing about them. It is in practicing them until they are automatic. The person who reaches for box breathing the moment panic begins to set in does so because they have practiced it hundreds of times in moments of relative calm, building the neural pathway that makes the technique accessible even when their nervous system is under load. You cannot wait until the crisis arrives and then try to remember the technique. You practice the technique now, daily, deliberately, so that when life hits you with something genuinely difficult, the response is already wired in, already available, already part of who you are. Chapter 4. The Art of Emotional Distance. How to feel without being destroyed by what you feel. There is a difference between having an emotion and being an emotion. Most people do not know this distinction exists, and because they don't know it exists, they experience every difficult feeling as a total event, something that swallows them whole, that they are entirely inside of, with no separation between the one who is feeling and the feeling itself. When sadness comes, they do not observe sadness, they become sadness. When fear arrives, they do not notice fear. They are fear, and because they are the emotion, rather than the one experiencing it, they have no distance from which to choose how to respond. The emotion simply acts through them, driving decisions, shaping words, directing behavior, while the person who is supposedly in charge watches helplessly from inside the storm they are simultaneously identified with. The skill this chapter teaches is one of the most transformative you will ever develop. It is the ability to create what psychologists call psychological distance between yourself and your emotional experience to become, even in the midst of intense feeling, the one who is observing the feeling rather than the one who is consumed by it. This does not mean suppressing your emotions or pretending they are not there. Emotional suppression is one of the most psychologically damaging strategies a person can employ, consistently linked to increased anxiety, deteriorating physical health, damaged relationships, and long-term emotional dysregulation. What it means is something far more sophisticated. Feeling fully, while simultaneously maintaining enough of an observer's perspective to prevent the feeling from making all of your decisions for you. Acceptance and commitment therapy. One of the most empirically supported psychological frameworks developed in the last 30 years uses a technique called cognitive diffusion. to help people create this distance from their thoughts and emotions. The core insight behind diffusion is this: you are not your thoughts. Thoughts are events in your mind. They arise, they occur, they pass. They have content, sometimes painful, sometimes frightening, sometimes overwhelming content, but they do not have inherent authority. A thought that says, "Everything is ruined," is not a factual report. It is a mental event. And the moment you can see it as a mental event rather than living inside it as though it were reality, you recover enormous psychological freedom. The thought does not disappear, but its grip on your behavior loosens dramatically. One of the simplest and most effective diffusion techniques is linguistic reframing. Instead of saying to yourself, "I am overwhelmed," you say, "I notice I am having the experience of overwhelm." Instead of, "I am terrified," you say, "I notice my mind is generating fear right now." This tiny linguistic shift creates a subtle but profoundly important separation between the observing self, the stable, continuous you that watches your experience, and the content of that experience. You step, even slightly, outside the weather of your emotions, and from that slightly outside position, you can choose your response rather than simply being driven by the feeling. Research, led by neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA, has found that the act of labeling an emotion, putting it into words, naming what you are experiencing measurably, reduces the activity of the amygdala and increases the activity of the prefrontal cortex. In brain scans, simply saying to yourself, "I feel angry," or "I feel afraid," produces a detectable shift in neural activity away from the reactive, threat-focused regions of the brain and toward the more reflective, regulatory regions. The act of naming creates distance, and distance creates choice. This is not a metaphor. It is observable biology. The RAIN technique is another framework that helps people move through difficult emotional experiences without either suppressing them or being consumed by them. RAIN stands for recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. You begin by recognizing what is happening, naming the emotion clearly and honestly. I am feeling grief. I am feeling rage. I am feeling fear. Then you allow it. You stop fighting the feeling. Stop trying to push it away or argue yourself out of it, and instead give it permission to be present. The paradox of emotional experience is that resistance amplifies. The more you fight a feeling, the louder it gets. Allowing it, acknowledging its presence without feeding it or acting on it is what begins to reduce its intensity. Then you investigate with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. You explore where the emotion lives in your body. Where do you feel this? What does it feel like physically? What belief or unmet need is underneath it? Investigation moves you from being inside the emotion to examining it from alongside it. And finally, you nurture. You bring the same quality of care to yourself that you would bring to a close friend who was experiencing exactly what you are experiencing right now. Not minimizing, not dismissing, but genuinely kind. Journaling is one of the most powerful and most underused tools for creating emotional distance and facilitating what psychologist James Pennebaker calls expressive writing. The translation of emotional experience into language which has been shown in dozens of studies to reduce psychological distress, improve immune function, lower cortisol levels, and significantly improve long-term emotional regulation. The mechanism is straightforward. When you write about what you are feeling, you externalize it. You take something that was swirling formlessly inside you and give it structure, boundaries, and a location outside your mind. And once it has an external location, you can examine it rather than being trapped inside it. Even 15 minutes of honest, unfiltered journaling about a difficult emotional experience has been shown to produce measurable benefits that persist for weeks. The deepest truth about emotional distance is this: you are not trying to feel less. You are learning to feel in a way that preserves your capacity to function, to choose, and to grow. Emotions are not problems to be solved. They are information. They tell you what matters, what has been violated, what you need. The goal is to receive that information clearly, which requires the distance to hear it, without allowing it to override every other source of wisdom available to you. The person who can sit with grief without becoming grief, who can feel fear without being governed by it, who can experience anger without being weaponized by it, that person is not emotionally diminished. That person is emotionally free. Chapter 5. Who you are. When the storm hits, building an identity that chaos cannot break. Here is one of the most psychologically devastating things that happens to people when life falls apart. They lose themselves. Not in a metaphorical, vague sense, but literally, concretely, in the very specific and measurable sense that the self they understood themselves to be the one defined by the role they played, the success they achieved, the relationship they held, the status they had earned, the future they were building, suddenly no longer exists. The business fails, and the entrepreneur does not know who they are without it. The marriage ends, and the spouse cannot recognize themselves in the mirror. The diagnosis arrives, and the healthy, capable person they believe themselves to be evaporates overnight. The job disappears, and the identity that was built around competence, contribution, and professional worth collapses with it. This is not weakness. This is what happens when identity is built on circumstances rather than character. And it is one of the most common and most destructive ways human beings construct their sense of self, tying who they are to what they have, what they do, what others think of them, and what their life looks like from the outside. Because all of those things, every single one, can be taken. And when they are taken, the person built on top of them has nothing left to stand on. The Stoic philosophers spent considerable time and considerable care thinking about this problem, because they lived in a world where the circumstances of a person's life could change catastrophically and without warning. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of the most powerful civilization on earth, a man who commanded armies and governed millions, wrote extensively in his private journals about the importance of what he called the inner citadel, the unassailable interior fortress of character and values that no external event could penetrate. The body can be imprisoned, he wrote. The reputation can be destroyed. The possessions can be confiscated. The position can be stripped away. But the character, the commitment to virtue, to reason, to responding well to whatever arises that cannot be touched by any force outside yourself. It is the one thing that is entirely and permanently yours. Modern psychology has arrived at essentially the same insight through a very different route: acceptance and commitment therapy. The same framework introduced in the previous chapter places enormous emphasis on what it calls values-based living. orienting your behavior around your core values rather than around the pursuit of specific outcomes or the avoidance of specific feelings. Values are fundamentally different from goals. A goal is an outcome, something you either achieve or you don't. A value is a direction, a quality of being and acting that you can embody regardless of what your circumstances are. You can value courage even when you are terrified. You can value kindness even when you are treated unkindly. You can value integrity even when dishonesty would be easier. And because values, unlike goals, cannot be blocked by circumstances, an identity rooted in values is structurally immune to the kind of collapse that an identity rooted in circumstances will always be vulnerable to. This distinction is not philosophical abstraction. It has enormous practical consequences for how you experience difficulty. When your identity is primarily successful entrepreneur and the business fails, you lose not just a business but yourself. When your identity is primarily person who acts with integrity, who keeps showing up, who treats people with respect, who refuses to be defeated by adversity, and the business fails, you lose a business. That is painful, but you do not lose yourself. Because the business failing does not contradict or erase any of the values-based qualities that define who you are. If anything, how you respond to the failure becomes another opportunity to demonstrate and deepen those qualities. The crisis becomes, paradoxically, a place where your identity is not destroyed, but clarified. Psychological flexibility, another core concept from ACT, and one of the most robustly researched predictors of mental health and resilience, is the ability to stay in contact with your values and continue moving in the direction they point, even in the presence of difficult thoughts, painful emotions, and deeply unfavorable circumstances. It is, in essence, the ability to be moved without being swept away, to feel the full weight of what is happening without losing your bearings. Flexible people are not people who feel less. Research consistently shows they feel just as much as anyone else, but they maintain a relationship with their values that is stronger than their relationship with their current emotional state, which means they can act from their deepest self even when that self is hurting. How do you build this kind of identity? It begins with clarity. Most people have never explicitly defined what their core values are. They live by implicit, unexamined values. Values inherited from their family, their culture, their conditioning, without ever having chosen them deliberately. And implicit values cannot anchor you, because you don't know they are there until they are tested. The first step is to sit with the question genuinely, without rushing of who you are when you strip away everything that can be taken. Not what you do, not what you have, not what others think of you, but what you stand for, how you treat people, what you refuse to compromise. What kind of person you are committed to being on your worst day, in your hardest moment, with the least to show for it. Write it down. Not as a performance for anyone else, not as a brand statement or a social media bio, but as a private covenant with yourself. These are the qualities I will carry into every situation life presents. This is who I am, regardless of what my life currently looks like. This is the foundation beneath every role I play and every goal I pursue. Because foundations matter most when everything above them is shaking. And when you have a foundation that is genuinely yours, built from your own examined values, expressed in your own honest language, tested and refined through your own lived experience, you discover something remarkable. You discover that the chaos outside you no longer has the power to create chaos inside you. Not because life gets easier, but because you finally know, with a certainty that circumstances cannot touch, exactly who you are. Chapter 6. The Acceptance Paradox: How Letting Go Gives You More Power Than Holding On. There is a counterintuitive truth at the heart of human psychology that most people spend their entire lives fighting against. And the fighting itself is what keeps them suffering. It is this: the harder you resist what is happening, the more power it gains over you. The tighter you grip a reality you cannot change, the more that reality controls your inner state. The more energy you pour into refusing to accept a painful situation, the more of yourself you lose to it, until the situation is not just something you are dealing with, but something you are entirely consumed by, something that has colonized your mind and made your inner life a continuous war against what is. This is the acceptance paradox. And understanding it is not just intellectually interesting, it is one of the most practically liberating shifts in perspective available to a human being. When most people hear the word acceptance, they hear surrender. They hear passivity. They hear a kind of resigned, defeated giving up that is fundamentally incompatible with strength, ambition, or the will to change difficult circumstances. That interpretation is completely wrong, and it is important to address it directly before going any further. Acceptance, as it is understood in psychology, and as it will be used throughout this chapter, has nothing to do with approving of what has happened, nothing to do with deciding that what happened was okay, and nothing to do with abandoning the desire or effort to improve your situation. Acceptance means one specific thing: acknowledging, without resistance, that what has happened, that what currently exists, That reality, as it stands right now, is what it is regardless of whether you believe it should be different. That distinction is everything. Because you can fully accept a reality and simultaneously work with every resource available to you to change it. What you cannot do, what no human being can do, and remain psychologically intact, is effectively address a reality you are refusing to acknowledge. Resistance to what is does not change what is. It only adds the suffering of the resistance on top of the suffering of the original circumstance. The concept of psychological pain versus psychological suffering is one of the most useful distinctions in the entire field of human well-being. Pain is the direct experience of something difficult, the grief of loss, the fear of uncertainty, the ache of failure. Pain is largely unavoidable. It is the natural, honest response of a conscious being to a world that does not always cooperate with what we need and want. Suffering, however, is what happens when we add our resistance to the pain, when we tell ourselves that what is happening should not be happening, that it is unbearable, that we cannot cope, that life has failed us, that this should not be our reality. Suffering is pain multiplied by non-acceptance. And unlike pain, which cannot always be controlled, the degree to which we suffer is something we have far more influence over than most people realize. The research on acceptance as a psychological practice is substantial and consistent. Studies examining the outcomes of acceptance and commitment therapy compared to more traditional approaches consistently show that people who learn to practice acceptance of difficult internal experiences, thoughts, emotions, memories, physical sensations report lower levels of overall psychological distress, greater functional well-being, and significantly greater resilience when encountering future adversity. Not because their circumstances were better, but because they stopped fighting the wrong battle. Buddhism arrived at this same understanding thousands of years before modern psychology codified it. The second noble truth of Buddhism identifies the origin of suffering not as painful circumstances themselves, but as craving the desperate insistence that things be different from how they are. This is not fatalism. The tradition that teaches acceptance of what is also teaches compassionate, purposeful action to reduce suffering in the world. Acceptance and action are not opposites. They are partners. Acceptance frees the energy that was locked in resistance and makes it available for the kind of clear, grounded, deliberate action that actually produces change. Here is what acceptance feels like when you practice it genuinely. It does not feel like giving up. It does not feel like indifference. It often feels, initially, like grief, because accepting reality fully means letting go of the version of reality you had been insisting on, the one that would have been, should have been, could have been. You grieve the plan that did not work, the relationship that ended, the version of the future that will not happen now. And on the other side of that grief is something remarkable: clarity. The mental resources that were entirely consumed by resistance, by the exhausting, endless argument with what has become available again. And in that availability, you discover that you can think, choose, plan, and act more effectively than you could at any point when you were still fighting the reality you were living in. Letting go is not weakness. Letting go is the act of a person who has decided that their energy is too valuable to waste on battles that cannot be won, and who is reserving it, instead, for the battles that can. There is also a relational dimension to acceptance that is worth naming clearly. When you stop resisting your own reality, you stop needing others to validate your resistance. You stop needing the people around you to agree that what happened to you was unfair, to confirm that you have a right to be devastated, to endlessly reinforce the story of what should have been different. This need, and it is a real, understandable human need, quietly poisons relationships over time because it asks other people to stay in the pain with you in a way that prevents both of you from moving forward. Acceptance liberates not only you, but the people who love you from the gravitational pull of an unresolvable argument with the past. And in that liberation, something new becomes possible, not the old life restored, but a genuinely new one, built with clear eyes on the actual ground beneath your feet. Chapter 7. Rewiring the threat response, training your brain to choose calm over panic. Your brain, as it exists right now, has a bias, not a moral bias, not a philosophical one, a deeply embedded neurological bias toward threat. It is called the negativity bias, and it is not a character flaw. It is an evolutionary inheritance from ancestors whose survival depended on their ability to notice danger faster than they noticed safety, to remember pain more vividly than pleasure, to scan their environment for what could go wrong rather than cataloging what was going right. The brain that kept your ancestors alive was a brain that was exquisitely sensitive to threat, one that could recognize the rustle in the grass that might be a predator and sound the alarm before any conscious thought had been formed. That brain is your brain. And while the environment has changed beyond recognition, while the threats you face today are almost never physical, almost never immediate, and almost never the kind that require a body flooded with adrenaline, the threat detection hardware has not been upgraded. It is still running on ancient firmware in a modern world. Every email that feels like a criticism, every conversation that feels tense, every uncertainty about the future that your mind turns over at 2 in the morning, your amygdala processes all of these with the same basic alarm architecture it would use to process a genuine physical threat. The result is a nervous system that is chronically overactivated, a mind that is constantly scanning for what could go wrong, and a baseline psychological state that sits much closer to anxiety than to peace. Not because life is genuinely dangerous, but because the brain has not been trained to distinguish between threats that require emergency mobilization and difficulties that require thoughtful engagement. The good news, and this is grounded in decades of neuroscience research, is that the negativity bias is not fixed. It is a default setting, not a permanent condition. And defaults can be changed through deliberate, consistent practice. This is the work of this chapter. Understanding the specific mechanisms by which the threat response is maintained and amplified, and then building the counter practices that systematically reduce its dominance and create, in its place, a new default. One oriented not toward panic but toward calm, not toward threat scanning but toward opportunity recognition, not toward the assumption that something is wrong but toward the capacity to assess accurately what is actually happening and respond accordingly. The first mechanism to understand is what researchers call rumination, the tendency of the anxious mind to replay distressing events or anticipated threats over and over, as if by thinking about the problem enough times it might be solved, as if by worrying about what could go wrong it might be prevented. Rumination feels productive. It feels like problem solving. But research by Yale psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema, who spent decades studying the effects of repetitive negative thinking, found that rumination is one of the primary drivers of both depression and anxiety, not because it generates useful solutions, but because it keeps the nervous system in a state of sustained alarm and strengthens the neural pathways associated with negative emotional processing. The more you ruminate, the better your brain gets at ruminating. The more you practice threat-focused thinking, the more automatic threat-focused thinking becomes. The counter-practice is not positive thinking, not the forced, artificial insistence that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. The counter-practice is what researchers call cognitive reappraisal, the deliberate, honest examination of a threatening situation to identify alternative interpretations that are equally valid but less catastrophic. When you receive critical feedback, and your immediate interpretation is that you are failing and will be exposed as inadequate, cognitive reappraisal asks, what else could this mean? Could this mean that the person giving feedback believes I am capable of improving? Could this be information I can use to grow, rather than evidence of my fundamental inadequacy? The goal is not to deny the difficulty, but to expand the range of possible interpretations beyond the most threatening one. And because the brain's threat response is driven by interpretation rather than raw facts, expanding interpretation reliably and measurably reduces threat activation. The second mechanism is avoidance. When something triggers anxiety, a difficult conversation, a task that feels overwhelming, a situation associated with past failure, the instinctive response is to avoid it, and avoidance works beautifully in the short term. It immediately reduces the discomfort, but over time, avoidance teaches the brain something deeply damaging: that the avoided thing is genuinely dangerous, that you cannot handle it, that the relief of escape is preferable to the discomfort of engagement. Every time you avoid, you reinforce the threat response. The avoided thing grows larger and more frightening in your mind, and you grow smaller in relation to it. The counter-practice is graduated exposure, the deliberate, progressive engagement with the things that trigger anxiety, in a structured way that allows the nervous system to learn, through direct experience, that the threat is manageable. This is the principle behind virtually every effective anxiety treatment that exists. Exposure does not just reduce avoidance. It literally rewires the brain's threat associations. When you approach something that frightened you and discover that you can handle it, not that it is pleasant, not that it doesn't challenge you, but that you can handle it, the amygdala's alarm response to that stimulus weakens. The neural pathway that linked that situation to danger is weakened by the competing evidence of your actual experience of surviving and handling it. Repeated enough times, the new association becomes dominant. The alarm quiets. And what was once a source of panic becomes something you can face with equanimity, not because it changed, but because you changed in relation to it. The third mechanism, and perhaps the most underappreciated, is the powerful role of the body in maintaining and amplifying the threat response. The body does not just express the mind's emotional states, it feeds them. Chronic muscle tension, shallow breathing, poor posture, and sleep deprivation all create physiological conditions that the brain interprets as signals of threat, which in turn increases threat detection sensitivity and the likelihood of reactive, panicked responses. This is a bidirectional loop. Mind activates body. Body signals back to mind, and it means that training the body is not separate from training the mind. Regular physical exercise has been shown in numerous studies to reduce amygdala reactivity, increase prefrontal cortex activity, and produce lasting reductions in baseline anxiety. Adequate sleep, 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep, is not a luxury but a neurological requirement for emotional regulation. Sleep-deprived brains show up to 60% greater amygdala reactivity than well-rested ones. The person who wants a calmer mind must take serious responsibility for the physical conditions they are creating for that mind to operate in. Rewiring the threat response is not a weekend project. It is a sustained campaign of small, daily, deliberate choices, each one incrementally shifting the balance of your neural architecture away from reactive alarm and toward grounded calm. It is choosing to reappraise rather than catastrophize, to approach rather than avoid, to move your body and rest it adequately, to practice the breathing and grounding techniques from earlier chapters until they become instinctive. Done consistently, these choices do not just change your behavior, they change who you are at the level of brain function. They change your baseline. And a different baseline changes everything. Chapter 8. The stories you tell yourself, how your inner narrative shapes your reality under pressure. Inside your mind right now, there is a storyteller. It has been there your entire life. A voice, a narrator, a running commentary on everything that is happening to you, around you, and within you. It tells you what events mean. It tells you what people think of you. It tells you what the future holds, what you are capable of, what you deserve, and what is fair. It connects the dots between past and present and projects them forward into predictions about what is coming. And here is the thing about this narrator that most people have never been told, and that changes everything once you understand it. The narrator is not reporting reality. It is constructing it. The stories you tell yourself about your life are not neutral transcriptions of fact. They are interpretations shaped by your past experiences, your deepest fears, your most entrenched beliefs, the emotional state you happen to be in when the event occurs, and the narrative framework you have built up over years of living. Two people can go through an objectively identical experience, a job loss, a rejection, a conflict, and tell completely different stories about it. One person's story is, "This is a disaster that proves I am not good enough, and that good things never last for me." The other person's story is, "This is painful and unexpected, and it is going to require me to find a different path, and I have found different paths before." Same facts, radically different narratives, and those different narratives produce radically different emotional experiences, different physiological responses, different decisions, and different outcomes. The story is not a reflection of reality. The story shapes reality. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most thoroughly researched and validated psychological treatments ever developed, is built almost entirely on this insight. The core principle is that it is not events themselves that produce emotional and behavioral consequences. It is our interpretation of events. The same principle was articulated by Epictetus 2,000 years ago when he wrote that it is not things that disturb people but their judgments about things. And research by psychologist Aaron Beck, who developed CBT, and Albert Ellis, who developed rational emotive behavior therapy, has demonstrated thousands of times over that systematic examination and revision of the stories people tell about their experiences produces measurable and lasting improvements in emotional well-being, even when the circumstances themselves do not change at all. Under pressure, when life gets genuinely hard and the stakes feel high, the storyteller in your mind does not become more accurate. It becomes more extreme. It reaches for the most dramatic interpretation available. It catastrophizes. It generalizes from a single painful event to a sweeping conclusion about your life, your worth, your future. A business setback becomes, "I am a failure." A relationship conflict becomes, "I am unlovable." A health scare becomes, "Everything is falling apart." These cognitive distortions, as they palgy, a note puck, a business setback, are called in CBT, feel like accurate perceptions of reality when you are inside them. They feel like clear-eyed recognition of the truth about your situation. But they are not truths. They are stories. And stories can be rewritten. The most dangerous stories are not the ones you tell openly, in conversation or in your journal, but the ones that run in the background, the ones so deeply embedded in your interpretation of life that you don't even recognize them as stories. They feel like observations. They feel like facts. They sound like, "I am not the kind of person who can handle this," or "Every time I get close to something good, it gets taken away," or "I always end up alone," or "I am too far behind to catch up." These background narratives operate as filters through which every new experience is processed, confirming themselves continuously because the mind, through the mechanism of confirmation bias, is extraordinarily skilled at finding evidence for whatever it already believes and ignoring evidence that contradicts it. The practice of narrative examination begins with one deceptively simple question: is this story actually true? Not, does it feel true? Because the most damaging stories feel utterly true while you are inside them. But is it factually, demonstrably, objectively true? And then, even if some version of it is true, is this the only story that fits the facts? Is there another interpretation, one that is equally consistent with the evidence but less catastrophic, less self-defeating, less limiting? Is there a story that acknowledges the real difficulty without adding the additional layer of, and this means I am broken, hopeless, or permanently damaged? The most powerful narratives you can build under pressure are not the ones that deny difficulty. Those are false comfort, and they collapse under the weight of reality. They are the ones that acknowledge difficulty honestly while simultaneously holding space for your own capacity to navigate it. This is genuinely hard, and I have survived hard things before. I don't know how this will work out, and I have figured out difficult situations in the past. I am in pain right now, and pain does not mean defeat. These reframes are not wishful thinking. They are more complete and more accurate representations of reality than the catastrophic alternatives because they include the dimension of your own history, your own resilience, your own demonstrated capacity to endure and adapt. The story you tell yourself about what is happening to you right now is determining your experience of it far more than the objective facts of the situation are. And that means that changing the story, examining it, questioning it, expanding it, rewriting its most damaging passages is not just a psychological exercise. It is one of the most concrete and consequential changes you can make in your life. Chapter 9. Stillness as Strategy. Why the calmest person in the room always wins. In any situation charged with difficulty, urgency, conflict, or uncertainty, there is an invisible dynamic playing out alongside the visible one. The visible dynamic is whatever the situation appears to be on the surface: the argument, the crisis, the negotiation, the breakdown, the pressure. The invisible dynamic is about who is governing their own internal state most effectively. And in that invisible dynamic, the calmest person always has the advantage. Not always the most knowledgeable person, not always the most experienced or most senior or most intelligent, the calmest. Because calm is not merely a pleasant emotional state. It is a cognitive, strategic, and interpersonal resource of extraordinary power, one that most people surrender voluntarily in exactly the moments they need it most. Think about the leaders and individuals you have most admired in moments of genuine difficulty. The surgeon who remains precise and deliberate when a life is in their hands. The negotiator who stays measured when the other side escalates. The parent who keeps their voice steady when everything is chaotic. The entrepreneur who makes clear decisions when the company is under threat. What you are observing in those people is not the absence of emotion. They feel everything, often more acutely than those who are visibly reacting. What you are observing is the capacity to maintain access to their full cognitive and emotional resources even when the pressure is highest. And that capacity, that retained access to clarity, precision, judgment, and wisdom under fire, is the practical definition of stillness. Ryan Holiday, in his study of Stoic philosophy and its application to modern life, identifies stillness not as inactivity, but as the internal condition that makes effective action possible. The person who is reactive, whose emotional state is driven entirely by external events, is constantly off balance, constantly responding to the last thing that happened, constantly making decisions from a position of disruption. The person who has cultivated stillness, who can, even in chaos, find a moment of internal quiet from which to assess, choose, and act, operates from a position of ground. And from ground, their decisions are better. Their communication is more effective. Their presence is more stabilizing to everyone around them. Their errors are fewer, and their recovery from setbacks is faster. The research on decision-making under stress is consistent and sobering. When the nervous system is activated, when cortisol and adrenaline are elevated, when the amygdala is dominant and the prefrontal cortex is compromised, the quality of decision-making deteriorates in measurable and predictable ways. People become more risk-averse in situations where risk is appropriate and more impulsive in situations where caution is needed. They narrow their attention to immediate threats and lose the ability to consider longer-term consequences. They are more susceptible to cognitive biases, less capable of weighing competing considerations, and more likely to make decisions they will later regret. This is not a character failing in stressed people. It is what the human brain does when it is in survival mode. It trades nuance for speed, wisdom for reaction, and strategic thinking for short-term threat management. Stillness is the deliberate practice of not going into survival mode when survival mode is not required. It is the ongoing training of your nervous system to stay in the window of optimal functioning, alert and engaged, but not overwhelmed, responsive, but not reactive, even when circumstances are applying pressure to push you out of that window. And it is built through practices that most high-performing individuals and organizations have recognized as essential, even as the broader culture continues to prize visible urgency and constant motion over the deeper power of composed deliberateness. One of the most important stillness practices is what contemplative traditions across cultures have called silence. The deliberate creation of spaces in your day and your life that are free from input, stimulation, demand, and noise. Not merely the absence of sound, but the cultivation of mental quiet, time in which you are not consuming, not producing, not performing, not reacting to anything, simply being present with yourself and with reality as it is. Modern life has made this extraordinarily difficult and, in many circles, nearly shameful. To be still is associated with being unproductive. To be quiet is associated with having nothing to say. To sit without doing is associated with wasting time. This cultural contempt for stillness is one of the reasons so many people are chronically overwhelmed. They have built lives that leave no room for the internal recalibration that stillness provides. And then they wonder why they cannot think clearly, why they feel perpetually behind, why their decisions keep leading them somewhere other than where they want to go. Regular meditation, even in the modest form of 10 to 20 minutes per day of focused, intentional silence, has been documented in dozens of peer-reviewed studies to reduce baseline anxiety, improve emotional regulation, increase attentional control, and strengthen the prefrontal cortex's capacity to maintain governance over the amygdala during high-pressure situations. But meditation is not the only path to stillness. Walking in nature without a device, sitting with a cup of tea and genuinely tasting it, driving in silence, writing without an agenda. These are all forms of the same practice, the practice of being fully present with one moment, without resistance and without agenda, which trains the nervous system to rest and the mind to find its natural quiet. There is also a social consequence of cultivated stillness that deserves attention because it reaches far beyond the individual who practices it. Calm is contagious. The nervous system is a social organ. It reads the emotional states of other people constantly and automatically, through tone of voice, body language, facial expression, and the pace and quality of speech. When you walk into a chaotic situation carrying genuine stillness, not performed composure, not forced cheerfulness, but real internal ground, the people around you feel it. Their own nervous systems begin to regulate in response to yours. This is the neurological basis of what great leaders, great therapists, great parents, and great friends all share. The capacity to be a regulating presence for others, to bring the temperature of a room down simply by being in it. That capacity is built not in the crisis, but in the daily practice of cultivating your own inner quiet, long before the moment when someone else needs you to be steady for them. The calmest person in the room is rarely the one who was born unflappable. They are almost always the one who has invested most seriously in their own internal state, who has treated their peace of mind not as a pleasant bonus when life cooperates, but as a deliberate, daily, non-negotiable practice. When the storm comes, they do not suddenly become calm. They are already calm, because they have been practicing calm every day in the ordinary moments. And that practice, accumulated over time, becomes not just a technique they use, but a way they are. Chapter 10. The Discipline of Presence. How to Stop Living in the Crisis that has not happened yet. Here is where most of your suffering actually lives. Not in what is happening right now. Not in what is in front of you at this moment. In this room. In this breath. Most of your suffering, if you examine it, honestly lives in a time that does not exist. It lives in the future. In the scenario that hasn't occurred yet, but that your mind has already begun to construct in horrifying detail. The conversation that might go badly. The diagnosis that might be worse. The opportunity that might not come through. The relationship that might not survive. The money that might run out. The children who might struggle. The career that might not go anywhere. Your mind takes the uncertainty of the present and fills it, almost automatically, with the worst-case version of tomorrow. And then it makes you live there, makes you feel the full emotional weight of a catastrophe that does not yet exist and may never exist, while the actual moment you are in goes largely unwitnessed. This is the anxiety loop, and it is extraordinarily sophisticated. It disguises itself as preparation. It tells you that by worrying about what could go wrong, you are being responsible, being thorough, being the kind of person who does not get caught off guard. It tells you that if you just think through the worst-case scenario enough times, you will somehow be protected from it, or at least ready for it. But research on worry and its effects on both mental health and actual preparedness consistently shows that this is a lie. The anxious mind tells itself. Worry does not improve your preparation for future difficulties. It does not generate better solutions. It does not protect you from bad outcomes. What it does is consume the present moment. The only moment in which you actually have any power to act, to choose, to respond, to change anything at all in service of a future that exists only in imagination and that your worry will not alter. The present moment is not just philosophically important. It is neurologically the only place where your prefrontal cortex can function optimally. Your capacity for clear thought, wise decision-making, creative problem-solving, and genuine connection with other people exists in the now. When your attention is pulled into the future-running disaster scenarios, rehearsing conversations that haven't happened, calculating the probability of outcomes you cannot control, you are not fully in the present moment. And therefore you are not fully in possession of your best cognitive and emotional resources. You are making decisions and forming responses from a state of partial presence, with part of your mind already somewhere else, already reacting to something that has not happened yet. The discipline of presence is the intentional, practiced return of your attention to what is actually happening right now. Not as a way of ignoring the future. Thoughtful planning and realistic assessment of what lies ahead are valuable and necessary, but as a way of refusing to allow imagined future suffering to colonize the actual experience of your life. Jon Kabat-Zinn, who pioneered the integration of mindfulness practice into clinical medicine, defines mindfulness as paying attention in a particular way on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Those three elements are each essential. On purpose, you choose where your attention goes, rather than allowing it to be hijacked by the loudest narrative your mind is generating. In the present moment, in what is actually here, not what might be coming. Non-judgmentally, without adding the additional layer of criticism about the fact that your mind wandered, or that you are struggling, or that you should be doing better than this. The practice of presence does not require a meditation cushion or a retreat or any particular philosophy. It requires, at its most basic level, the decision to bring your full attention to whatever you are actually doing and to make that decision repeatedly throughout the day, as many times as the mind wanders away, which will be many times. You bring it back, without drama, without self-criticism, with the same patient, gentle firmness a good teacher brings to a distracted student. The mind has wandered fine. Bring it back. This moment, this breath, this conversation, this task, this reality, as it actually is. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to write one of the most profound books on human resilience ever published, wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom, our power to choose. That space is the present moment. It is where you actually exist. It is where your choices are made, where your responses are formed, where your life is actually lived. The future is a thought. The past is a memory. The only thing that is real, the only thing you can actually do anything with, is now. And the person who has trained themselves to inhabit now, fully and without the relentless pull of anxiety toward an imagined tomorrow, has access to a quality of clarity and power that the anxiety-driven, future-fixated mind simply cannot reach. Every time you choose to come back to the present moment, every time you feel the mind beginning to spiral into catastrophe, and you gently but firmly return your attention to what is real and immediate and available right now, you are not just managing anxiety. You are building a new habit of mind. You are weakening the neural pathway that leads automatically from uncertainty to catastrophizing, and strengthening the one that leads from uncertainty to grounded, present moment clarity, done consistently. This practice does not eliminate uncertainty from your life. Nothing can. But it eliminates the habit of suffering in advance of what might never arrive, and it returns to you the only time you ever truly have, which is now. One final thing about presence that is worth carrying with you. It is not only a practice for managing difficulty, it is the foundation of a fully lived life. The moments that matter most to you, the ones you will remember on your last day, the ones that constitute what you would call a meaningful existence, are almost never the ones where you were productive and efficient and planning 3 steps ahead. They are the ones where you were fully there, fully present with the person you love, with the view in front of you, with the work that mattered, with the moment as it actually was. Anxiety steals presence, and presence, once returned to, reveals something that all the planning and catastrophizing in the world cannot, that the life worth living is mostly happening right here, right now, in the ordinary, extraordinary moments that pass unnoticed when the mind is somewhere else. Train yourself to be here. What you find will be worth it. Chapter 11. Emotional Anchors, the practices that hold you together when life tries to pull you apart. Every person who has ever navigated a genuinely difficult period of their life, not just a hard week, but a sustained, grinding, disorienting stretch of time in which the usual sources of stability have been removed or compromised, knows this feeling. The sensation of drift, of being unmoored, of not knowing, from one day to the next, what to hold on to. The job is gone, or the relationship is over, or the health is uncertain, or the future that was so clearly mapped out has suddenly been erased, and in its absence, there is nothing familiar to orient around. The person who is organized around those external structures finds themselves floating, and floating feels, to the nervous system, like falling. What anchors people in those moments is not willpower. It is not optimism. It is not motivational content or the determination to think positively. What anchors people is practice. Specifically, it is the small, daily, embodied practices that create reliable islands of stability within an otherwise unstable experience, practices consistent enough that the nervous system can begin to build certainty around them, rituals dependable enough that the mind can use them as true north when everything else is shifting. These are what we can call emotional anchors, and they are not luxuries. For the person in genuine difficulty, they are survival. An emotional anchor is any practice that reliably returns you to a regulated, grounded state. One that you engage in consistently enough that it becomes a structural feature of your day rather than something you reach for only in crisis. The distinction matters enormously. A technique you try for the first time when you are already in full panic has very little power because your nervous system has no established association between the practice and safety. A technique you have been doing every morning for 6 months, by contrast, has been neurologically paired with calm so many times that simply beginning the practice starts to activate the parasympathetic response before you have even completed it. You are not just performing the technique. You are stepping into a well-worn groove in your neural architecture, one that leads reliably to ground. The most powerful emotional anchors share certain qualities. They are physical, meaning they involve the body and not just the mind, because the body is where emotional experience actually lives, and regulation that bypasses the body is always incomplete. They are consistent. meaning they happen at the same time and in the same way, with enough regularity that they become automatic rather than effortful. They are brief enough to be genuinely sustainable because anchors that require an hour of uninterrupted time become casualties of exactly the kind of chaotic periods during which they are most needed. And they are honest. They do not require you to pretend you feel better than you do, but simply to show up for the practice, regardless of how you feel. Morning is the highest leverage time for anchoring, not because there is anything magical about the early hours, but because what you do in the first 30 to 60 minutes of your day sets the neurological tone for everything that follows. A morning that begins with the immediate intake of news, social media, email, and other people's demands and urgencies before the nervous system has had time to stabilize from sleep is a morning that begins in reactivity. The brain's threat detection systems are activated before the prefrontal cortex has fully come online, and the day unfolds from that reactive baseline, a morning that begins instead with even a brief period of intentional quiet, 5 minutes of deliberate breathing, 10 minutes of movement, a page or two of writing by hand, 5 minutes of sitting with a cup of something warm and genuinely tasting. It is a morning that begins from ground, and the entire subsequent day is subtly different because of it. Movement is one of the most powerful emotional anchors available to a human being, and it is consistently underused as such. Not exercise in the performance sense, not the training program you feel guilty about skipping, but deliberate physical movement practiced with the specific intention of regulating your nervous system. Walking, particularly in natural environments, has been shown in research by Stanford psychologist Gregory Bratman to produce measurable reductions in rumination and activity in the subgenual prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with negative self-referential thinking. 20 to 30 minutes of walking in nature, practiced consistently, does not just improve mood in the immediate term. It gradually rewires the brain's baseline emotional tone over weeks and months. You do not need to run a marathon. You need to move your body deliberately and regularly, and let it do what it was designed to do. Rituals of closure, intentional practices that mark the end of periods of difficulty or demand, are equally important and far less commonly practiced. The nervous system has no automatic off switch. Without a deliberate signal that a period of difficulty has ended and that it is safe to rest, the body and mind continue running the stress response long after the stressor itself has passed. A simple closing ritual, a few minutes of writing down what you handled today, what you are grateful for, and what you will leave for tomorrow, teaches the nervous system that this moment, right now, is a boundary, that what happened today belongs to today, that tonight is for restoration. Over time, this kind of closure practice dramatically improves both sleep quality and the ability to be present in moments of rest, rather than continuing to process the day's difficulties unconsciously. Gratitude practice deserves specific mention here, not as a piece of positive thinking culture, but as a neurologically grounded anchor with a substantial evidence base. Research by psychologists Robert Emmons and Michael McCullough found that participants who wrote about things they were grateful for on a weekly basis reported higher levels of well-being, more optimism, fewer physical complaints, and greater life satisfaction than those who wrote about neutral or negative events. The mechanism is not mysterious. Gratitude practice deliberately directs the brain's attentional systems toward what is present and working, rather than what is absent and broken. And because attention shapes the neural pathways that govern emotional tone, consistently directing attention toward the good that exists, alongside the difficulty, gradually changes the brain's default orientation. This does not require pretending the difficulty is not real. It requires acknowledging, with equal honesty, that difficulty is almost never the whole picture. The deepest function of emotional anchors is not just regulation in the moment, it is identity reinforcement over time. Every time you show up for your anchor practice, especially on the days when you do not feel like it, especially on the days when everything is hard and the practice feels like one more demand on a depleted system, you are sending yourself a message. The message is, I am the kind of person who takes care of their own inner life. I am the kind of person who does not abandon myself when things get hard. I am the kind of person who shows up for themselves the way I would show up for someone I love. That message, accumulated across hundreds of repetitions, becomes a bedrock of self-trust. And self-trust, in the end, is the deepest anchor of all. Chapter 12. Relationships under pressure. How to stay connected when everything in you wants to shut down. There is something that happens to people under sustained pressure that is almost never talked about, but that causes some of the most significant damage of any crisis period. They disappear, not physically, but emotionally, relationally. They go somewhere else. They pull inward. They stop reaching out. They become shorter, more guarded, more isolated. The people they love most, the ones they most need during the hardest times, become the ones they are most unavailable to. And the reason this happens is not mystery. It is biology. The same threat response that prepares the body to fight or flee also, in more complex social situations, prepares it to withdraw. Connection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability to a nervous system under high alert feels dangerous. It takes energy that a depleted system does not believe it has. It risks rejection at the moment when rejection feels most unbearable. And so, the walls go up, the distance grows, and the person who needed connection most ends up profoundly alone in the middle of the people who would most readily have shown up for them. Understanding this pattern is the first step in refusing to let it define your hardest seasons. Because the research on human resilience is unambiguous on one point above almost all others. Social connection is not a supplement to resilience. It is one of its primary biological foundations. Harvard's study of adult development, which followed the lives of hundreds of people across more than 80 years, and is the longest-running study of human well-being ever conducted, found that the single most consistent predictor of who thrived through difficulty, who remained healthy, happy, and cognitively sharp into old age, was not wealth, not intelligence, not professional success, not diet or exercise, but the quality of their close relationships. People who were surrounded by warm, authentic, reciprocal relationships consistently fared better through every form of adversity. People who were isolated consistently fared worse. Not marginally worse, dramatically worse. The reason relationships protect us is neurological. Human beings are fundamentally social animals, and the nervous system co-regulates with other nervous systems in ways that individual self-regulation cannot fully replicate. When you are in the presence of someone who is genuinely safe, someone whose presence your nervous system has learned to associate with warmth, acceptance, and non-judgment, your parasympathetic system activates in a way that mirrors the effect of the best breathing or meditation practice. Being seen, being held, being in the physical presence of someone who cares about you produces real and measurable changes in cortisol levels, heart rate variability, inflammatory markers, and brain activity. Connection is medicine. It is physiological, not merely emotional. The challenge, then, is not finding reasons to value connection during hard times. Most people already know they need it. The challenge is managing the specific barriers that pressure creates. The most significant of these is shame. When life falls apart, when the failure is visible, when the loss is real, when the gap between where you are and where you thought you would be becomes undeniable, shame is the quiet poison that makes isolation feel not like withdrawal, but like protection. Shame says, if the people who love me really see what is happening, they will see me differently. They will see weakness, inadequacy, failure. They will judge me the way I am currently judging myself. And so the self protects against that imagined judgment by making itself unavailable for the scrutiny of love. Research by Brené Brown on vulnerability and shame has documented this mechanism with great precision. The antidote to shame, she found consistently, is not more self-protection but the opposite. The courageous act of speaking the shameful thing to a safe person, which invariably produces not the judgment that shame predicted, but empathy. The recognition that the person on the other side of the conversation has also known failure, also known fear, also known the gap between who they are and who they thought they would be. This does not solve the crisis, but it breaks the isolation. And breaking the isolation is, for many people in genuine difficulty, the single most transformative thing that can happen. There are also skills specific to maintaining relationships under pressure that are worth naming directly. The first is the capacity to ask for what you actually need, rather than either suffering in silence or venting without direction. People who love you want to help, but they often do not know how. Being specific, I need someone to listen without trying to fix anything right now, or I need practical help with this specific thing, or I need you to just sit with me for a while, gives the people around you the ability to actually show up in the way that will help, rather than in ways that may feel well-intentioned but miss the mark. Specificity is an act of trust, and trust is the currency that keeps relationships alive through hard seasons. The second skill is reciprocity, the ongoing effort, even when you are the one who is struggling, to stay genuinely interested in the lives of the people around you. This is not about performing wellness you do not feel. It is about refusing to let your own pain become so total that the relationship becomes entirely one-directional. People can sustain giving for a while, but relationships that survive difficulty over the long term do so because both people feel seen, valued, and genuinely cared for by the other, even when one of them is going through something the other is not. Even 10 minutes of genuine curiosity about someone else's life, even in the middle of your own hardest chapter, is an investment that returns enormous dividends in the quality of the relationship and in the quality of the support you receive in return. The final skill is the willingness to let people in imperfectly, to not wait until you have the words, or until you feel ready, or until the situation is resolved enough to discuss without crying. The people who love you do not need your composed, collected presentation of what happened to you. They need you, real, raw, struggling, trying. Let them see that, because in being seen that way, you give them something equally valuable. In return, the permission to be seen the same way by you when their time of difficulty arrives. And it will arrive. It always does. It is also worth saying something about what to do when the people in your life are not equipped to show up in the way you need, when the people closest to you are themselves depleted, or when your support network is genuinely thin. This is a real situation, not a hypothetical one, and it deserves an honest response rather than a platitude about reaching out. If the people immediately around you cannot give you what you need, the answer is to widen the circle deliberately through therapy, through community, through any context in which genuine human connection around real experience is made available. A therapist is not a last resort for people who are broken. A therapist is a trained, dedicated relational resource whose entire professional purpose is to be the safe presence for you that everyone deserves and not everyone has naturally in their lives. Seeking that resource is not weakness. It is the same intelligence that leads a person to see a doctor when they are physically ill. The recognition that some forms of difficulty genuinely require more than ordinary support can provide. Chapter 13. Turning Pain into Power, the Alchemy of Difficult Experiences. History is full of people who were broken by what happened to them, and equally full of people who were built by it. The difference is not in the severity of the suffering. Some of the most transformed people in history endured circumstances that would overwhelm any attempt to describe them as character building in any comfortable sense of the phrase. The difference is in what they did with the suffering and the relationship they chose to form with it, the meaning they refused to let it lack, the uses to which they put everything the difficulty had forced them to learn about themselves and about what it means to be alive. Post-traumatic growth is not a motivational concept. It is a clinically documented psychological phenomenon. First, formally studied by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun in the 1990s, who found that a substantial portion of people who had experienced significant trauma reported not just recovery, but genuine growth improvements in areas including personal strength, openness to new possibilities, relating to others, appreciation for life, and spiritual or existential depth that they attributed directly to their encounter with what had nearly broken them. The research is not suggesting that trauma is good, or that suffering is to be welcomed, or that the painful thing that happened to you was secretly a gift in disguise. It is documenting the fact that the human psyche, given the right conditions and the right orientation toward its own experience, is capable of not just surviving difficulty, but of being genuinely enlarged by it. The conditions that make post-traumatic growth possible are specific and learnable. They are not luck. They are not personality. They are practices and orientations that can be deliberately cultivated, which means that the question of whether your pain produces growth or produces only damage is, to a far greater degree than most people realize, something you have meaningful influence over. The first condition is the willingness to fully process what happened, rather than bypassing it. The cultural instinct in the face of pain, particularly in cultures that prize strength and forward momentum, is to move on as quickly as possible, to be okay, to get back to normal, to not dwell. But psychological research is consistent. Pain that is not processed does not disappear. It goes underground. It continues to shape behavior, relationships, and emotional life from below the surface, often in ways that are far more disruptive than the original, conscious experience of the difficult thing would have been. Processing means sitting with what happened in therapy, in honest conversation, in journaling, in whatever form allows you to move through the experience rather than around it until you have genuinely integrated it. until it is something that happened to you rather than something that is still invisibly happening. The second condition is meaning-making, the active, deliberate construction of a narrative about the experience that places it within the larger arc of your life in a way that is honest, complete, and ultimately purposeful. Meaning is not found in painful experiences. It is made. Viktor Frankl's fundamental insight, forged in conditions of incomprehensible suffering, was that the last human freedom, the one that cannot be taken regardless of external circumstances, is the freedom to choose one's attitude toward whatever happens. Not to approve of it, not to minimize it, but to decide what it means, what it points toward, what it has revealed, and what you will do with what you now know because of it. This meaning-making process often takes time, sometimes a great deal of time, and it cannot be forced or rushed. Arriving at the question of what this experience can teach and how it can serve something beyond your own survival of it is not something most people can do in the middle of acute suffering. But it is a question worth holding, worth returning to, and worth asking with increasing honesty as the acute phase begins to pass, and when answers come even partial, imperfect, uncertain answers. They are among the most powerful forces available for converting suffering into something that does not merely end, but transforms. The third condition is what might simply be called use the decision to put what you have learned through difficulty into active service. The person who has been through depression and uses that experience to sit with genuine compassion alongside a friend who is now going through it. The person who has experienced financial collapse and uses that knowledge to build something structurally sounder the second time, and to help others avoid the mistakes that cost them so much. The person who has endured a relationship breakdown and emerges from it with a depth of self-knowledge that makes every subsequent relationship more honest and more genuine. In each case, the pain has been converted into capacity, into wisdom, into empathy, into skill that would not have been possible without the difficult experience that produced it. Before exploring that fourth condition, it is worth saying something about the role of time in this process specifically. The importance of not judging yourself by where you are in the early days of a difficult experience. Post-traumatic growth is not a straight line. It does not follow a predictable schedule. Some people find meaning in their experience within months. Others take years. Some go through extended periods of anger and resistance and grief before any orientation toward growth becomes genuinely accessible. None of these timelines indicate failure. The capacity for growth is available to every person who has been through something genuinely hard, but it cannot be forced, and it cannot be rushed. And the attempt to pressure yourself into growing before you have finished grieving is itself a form of bypassing that delays the very process you are trying to accelerate. Give yourself the time the process actually needs. There is also a fourth condition, less frequently discussed but equally important. The choice to locate your difficult experience within a larger human context, rather than treating it as an isolated, uniquely personal catastrophe. When you understand that grief, failure, loss, fear, illness, and betrayal are not aberrations, but core features of the human experience, that every person who has ever lived has faced some version of what you are facing, something shifts in your relationship to the suffering, not because it hurts less, but because the isolation dissolves. You are not alone in this. You are not uniquely cursed or broken. You are human, And being human means being vulnerable to exactly the kinds of difficulties you are facing, and being equipped by the same nature that made you vulnerable with the capacity to survive them, integrate them, and grow through them. That recognition does not solve anything, but it changes the texture of the suffering in a way that makes everything else possible. This is the alchemy. Not denial, not performance, not false positivity. It is the genuinely hard, genuinely brave work of insisting that what broke you also, eventually, builds something in you that would not have existed any other way. Chapter 14. The long game building, a life that is structurally resistant to being shaken. Most people approach the question of resilience as a reactive project. They wait until life delivers something difficult and then attempt to cope, to manage the crisis, survive the period, recover the equilibrium. And while reactive resilience is far better than no resilience at all, it is inherently inefficient and exhausting because it requires the person to summon resources they may not have been systematically building during the periods of relative stability that preceded the difficulty. The person who begins building their internal resources only when they need them is like the person who starts saving money only when the emergency has arrived. The resources were needed before the crisis. Building them during it is possible, but far harder. Proactive resilience, the deliberate, ongoing construction of a life, a set of practices, and an internal architecture that is structurally resistant to disruption, is the real long game. It is the recognition that difficulty is not an aberration in an otherwise smooth life, but a reliable, recurring feature of any life fully lived, and that the question is not whether hard things will come, but whether you will have built the inner and outer conditions that allow you to face them from a position of genuine resource rather than depletion. The structural elements of a resilient life can be understood across several dimensions. The first is physical. The body is not separate from the mind's capacity for resilience. It is its foundation. Sleep is the single most important recovery mechanism the human body possesses, and the research on sleep deprivation's effects on emotional regulation, cognitive function, and stress reactivity is unambiguous. 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep per night is not indulgence. It is maintenance of the most essential system you own. Regular physical movement is equally non-negotiable, not as performance or aesthetics, but as neurological regulation. The person who exercises consistently has a measurably more resilient nervous system than the person who does not, because exercise directly trains the systems of stress response and recovery that resilience depends on. Nutrition, hydration, and the reduction of substances that artificially amplify the stress response are equally part of the physical architecture of a resilient life. None of these things are glamorous. All of them are foundational. The second dimension is relational. A life that is structurally resilient is a life that contains deep, genuine, reciprocal relationships, not hundreds of connections, but a meaningful few that can bear the weight of real honesty. Building and maintaining these relationships requires ongoing investment during the ordinary times. The phone call made not because there is news, but just to stay connected. The meal shared when everyone is busy, but you make time anyway. The honest conversation pursued, even when superficiality would be easier. Relationships, like physical fitness, do not hold their strength without maintenance. And the people who discover in crisis that they have no one to call do not usually make that discovery because no one cares about them. They make it because the relationships that could have been deep were kept shallow by neglect during the years when depth was available to build. The third dimension is financial. Not in the sense of wealth, but in the sense of margin. Financial stress is among the most reliable and most corrosive sources of psychological pressure available to modern human beings, because it is both relentless and often invisible until it becomes acute. Building a life with genuine financial margin, spending meaningfully less than you earn, maintaining reserves that could sustain a period of disruption, avoiding debt structures that leave no room for the unexpected, is not just financially prudent. It is psychologically protective. The person who has 3 months of living expenses available to them experiences a job loss as a serious challenge. The person who has no reserve experiences it as an emergency that floods the entire nervous system with existential threat. The financial architecture of your life directly shapes the psychological experience of the inevitable disruptions within it. The fourth dimension is purposive, the presence in your life of something that matters beyond the immediate and the personal. Research by psychologist Martin Seligman, who has spent decades studying the conditions that produce genuine human flourishing, consistently identifies meaning as one of the most powerful predictors of both well-being and resilience. People who have a sense of purpose are consistently more resilient in the face of adversity than those who do not. Not because purpose prevents pain, but because it provides a reference point that transcends current suffering, a horizon that remains visible even when the immediate landscape is obscured by difficulty. Whatever your purpose is, the work you are building, the people you are raising, the community you are serving, the problem you are trying to solve, its presence in your life is not a luxury of the good times. It is a resource for the hard ones. Purpose also functions as a generator of what psychologist Angela Duckworth identified in her landmark research as grit, the combination of passion and perseverance for long-term goals that she found, across multiple domains and populations, to be a better predictor of success and resilience than talent, intelligence, or circumstance. Grit is not brute stubbornness. It is the sustained capacity to keep showing up for something that matters, even when the showing up is costly, uncomfortable, or unrewarded in the short term. And that capacity is dramatically more available to the person who has a clear sense of why they are doing what they are doing, of what the work is in service of, what would be lost if they stopped, what kind of person they are committed to becoming through the doing of it. Purpose is the answer to the question that difficulty always asks, which is, why keep going? And without a real answer to that question, the hardest seasons will always threaten to win. The fifth dimension, and perhaps the most underestimated, is the dimension of skill. Specifically, the skills addressed throughout this audiobook: emotional regulation, narrative reframing, physiological self-management, acceptance, presence, identity clarity, the ability to process difficulty and extract meaning from it. These are not philosophical ideas. They are functional capacities that, like any skill, are either developed or undeveloped. The person who has never practiced emotional regulation when it was not urgently required has very little access to it when it is. The person who has been practicing it for 2 years imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely and with real engagement has built something that is available to them in crisis because it has been built before the crisis arrived. Building your inner skill set during the ordinary seasons of life is not navel-gazing. It is the most practical, long-term investment available to a human being, because the return on that investment is paid out in exactly the moments that matter most. The long game, ultimately, is the decision to take your own inner life seriously before the crisis arrives. to invest in your sleep, your movement, your relationships, your financial margin, your practices of self-regulation, and your sense of purpose, not because you are currently in difficulty, but because you are currently not, and you understand that the resources you build now are the ones you will draw on when the ground shifts beneath you. This is not pessimism. It is the most sophisticated form of optimism available. The belief that life will continue to be worth fully living, and the commitment to be fully equipped to live it. Chapter 15. The calm that never leaves who you become when you master your mind under pressure. There is a version of you that exists on the other side of everything this audiobook has described. Not a perfect version. Not a version that never struggles, never panics, never feels the full weight of what life can deliver. But a version that is fundamentally different in its relationship to difficulty, one that faces hard things from different ground, with different resources, from a different orientation toward what is happening and what it means and what can be done about it. That version of you is not hypothetical. It is not a motivational fantasy. It is the natural, documented outcome of the practices and the understandings that have been laid out across these 15 chapters, applied consistently and with genuine commitment over time. It is who you become when you take the training of your own mind seriously. What changes first, and most visibly, is your response latency, the time between something difficult happening and your reactive answer to it. The untrained mind responds to disruption almost instantaneously, driven by the amygdala's alarm systems before the prefrontal cortex has had any opportunity to weigh in. The trained mind still feels the initial surge. The training does not eliminate the amygdala's function, nor would you want it to, but it has built, through thousands of small practices and chosen responses, a reliable pause between stimulus and reaction. And in that pause lives everything. In that fraction of extended time, the wise self has the opportunity to ask, what is actually happening here? What do I know about this? What matters most in this moment? What would the person I am committed to being do right now? That pause is not dramatic. To an outside observer, it is nearly invisible, but its consequences compound across every decision made, every word spoken, every relationship navigated from that grounded place rather than from reactive alarm. What changes next is the quality of your presence in relationships. The person who has done this work, who has learned to regulate their own nervous system, to hold emotions with distance rather than being consumed by them, to identify the stories they are telling and choose more honest ones, to bring genuine stillness into their interactions, becomes, almost inevitably, a different kind of presence to the people around them. More genuinely attentive, less defended, less reactive to perceived slights or disappointments, more capable of hearing difficult things without shutting down or escalating, more able to be honest in ways that invite connection rather than create distance. People feel this, even when they cannot name it. They feel the difference between being in the presence of someone who is truly here and someone who is physically present but emotionally elsewhere. And the person who is truly here, regulated and grounded and genuinely available, becomes a rare and precious thing in a world that is largely running on reactive autopilot. What changes after that is your relationship to uncertainty itself. For most people, uncertainty is the primary engine of anxiety. It is the gap between what they know and what they need to know, between what they can predict and what remains open, between the stability they crave and the unpredictability that life consistently delivers. The untrained mind experiences that gap as threat, as a space that must be filled with either information or worry, because the uncertainty itself is intolerable. The trained mind, through the accumulated practice of sitting with what is not known, of being present in the unresolved, of making peace with the open question, that mind begins to develop something that can only be called genuine tolerance for ambiguity. Not comfort with everything being unknown, but the capacity to remain functional, grounded, and even curious in the face of what has not yet been determined. This tolerance is not passivity. It is freedom. It is the liberation of enormous psychological resources that were previously consumed by the desperate, futile attempt to resolve every uncertainty before it resolved itself. There is also a change that happens in the texture of your ordinary days, the days when nothing is particularly wrong, when life is proceeding at its normal pace and there is no obvious crisis to manage. Most people, in these ordinary days, do not experience genuine peace. They experience something closer to waiting, a low-level vigilance, a background hum of unease, a sense that the absence of crisis is merely temporary and that relaxing fully would be naive. This is the posture of a nervous system that has been conditioned to expect threat and has never been given consistent evidence that rest is safe. The trained mind, over time, unlearns this posture. Not completely and not permanently. Difficulty will always return the stress response to something like its old intensity for a period. But as a baseline condition, as the default state of a mind that has been consistently returned to the present, consistently anchored in values rather than circumstances, consistently given the experience of coming through hard things and finding itself intact, the default begins to shift. The waiting quiets, the vigilance softens, and in its place, something appears that most people, in the honestly examined depths of their hearts, have always wanted and never quite trusted themselves to have: a genuine, embodied, day-to-day sense of being okay. Not the okay of everything going well, not the okay of every problem solved and every uncertainty resolved. The okay of a person who knows from practice, from experience, from the accumulated evidence of their own life, that they can handle what comes, that the ground beneath them is real and it is theirs, that they have faced difficult things before and are still here, still themselves, still capable of caring and trying and loving and building, that the worst the world can deliver, while genuinely hard, is not the end of them. It is also worth naming what does not change, because the promise of this work is not that life becomes easy, and any version of that promise would be dishonest. Genuinely difficult things will still happen. Loss will still arrive without warning. People will still disappoint you. Plans will still collapse. There will still be mornings when the anxiety is high and the resources feel low, and the gap between who you want to be and who you are managing to be in that moment is wider than you would like. The work described in this audiobook does not eliminate any of that. What it does, what it reliably, demonstrably, and increasingly does, the longer and more genuinely you practice it, is change the duration, the intensity, and the meaning of those experiences. The difficult thing still lands, but you recover faster. The panic still rises, but it does not stay as long or go as deep. The story still turns catastrophic. Sometimes. But you catch it sooner and revise it more skillfully. Each repetition of the practice, each chosen grounded response, each moment of returning to the present rather than spiraling into an imagined future, all of it compounds. The interest rate on inner work is extraordinary, and it pays out for the rest of your life. This is what you have been building. Not a method for avoiding hardship, not a philosophy for people whose lives are going smoothly, but a complete, lived, practiced architecture of inner strength for exactly the life you are actually living, with all of its difficulty and all of its uncertainty and all of its grief and frustration and fear and the breathtaking, irreplaceable beauty that exists alongside all of those things, available to anyone who is present enough to see it. You have done the reading. You have heard the ideas. Now comes the only part that matters, the living of it. One practiced breath, one grounded choice, one honest story, one returned moment of presence at a time. That is how calm is built. And once built deeply enough, it does not leave.